Hello. We're excited. You don't belong here. The words sliced through the silence of the marble hall like a blade. The young officer who spoke them didn't even look up from his clipboard. His voice carried that particular strain of authority that hides insecurity beneath polished brass. He stood by the great oak doors leading to the presidential chamber, flanked by flags and portraits of men who had written history. Behind him, the corridor shimmered with the reflection of chandeliers, the scent of polished wood and old power thick in the air. Across from him stood a woman, small, still, steady. Her uniform was crisp but plain, the insignia almost invisible, as if she'd worn it more for respect than recognition. A faint scar crossed her left eyebrow, the kind that time couldn't quite smooth. Her hands, though clasped neatly in front of her, bore the faint tremor of exhaustion. He looked up then, scanning her with faint irritation. "Recruit access is for trainees and aides only," he muttered, gesturing toward the side corridor. "This entrance is for senior personnel." She didn't move. Her eyes, the color of a quiet storm, lingered on the heavy doors. She gave no explanation, no defense, just silence. It was the kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable, not timid, but patient, unyielding. Around them, others began to notice. A few staffers slowed their steps, glancing curiously. No one intervened, no one wanted to. In that building, rank and posture dictated everything. And to most of them, she looked like nobody. But she wasn't. Her name was Lieutenant Elara Vance, and every scar she carried had been earned on the edge of the world. Years earlier, Elara had served in a desert that swallowed man whole. The days there were soaked in sun and grit, and the nights howled with a wind that carried ghosts. She had led a search and rescue division that most called suicidal. They entered enemy territory not to kill, but to pull the wounded from fire. It wasn't glory they sought. It was the preservation of lives that war had already decided were lost. Once she had crawled across a minefield on her stomach for 9 hours to reach a downed pilot who'd radioed only once before static claimed him. When they found her afterward, she was half conscious, half buried in sand, the pilot clinging to her vest, still breathing. For that, she'd been quietly commended, not with medals, but with a folded note from her commanding officer. Just 5 words: "For those who don't leave." Then came the ambush that changed everything. A convoy she'd been ordered to protect was hit. Improvised explosives hidden in children's toys. She remembered the blast like an echo she could never silence. When she woke in a field hospital 3 days later, she learned that half her unit was gone. Her best friend, Sergeant Cale Mercer, had thrown himself on a grenade meant for her. He'd laughed about her coffee habits that morning. She hadn't spoken much since that day. She left active duty months later, citing personal health. The papers said she retired. The truth was, she simply stopped fighting wars others had forgotten. She returned home to quiet towns, worked at a veterans outreach clinic, teaching young recruits what courage looked like when no one was watching. The uniform she wore now was borrowed from that role, light, administrative, the kind of thing that kept her invisible. But today, she had been summoned. Not by the clinic, not by the military, but by an office whose letterhead bore the seal of the nation itself. The President's office. The young officer blocking her path didn't know that. To him, she was just another face, just another woman with tired eyes and a wrinkled badge. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried the weight of something ancient. "I have an appointment," he muttered. He smirked. "With who? The president?" She said nothing. The officer chuckled, shaking his head. "Lady, you're holding up the corridor. Move along." She still didn't move. Behind them, a man in a dark suit cleared his throat. He had the calm presence of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by human arrogance. His name was Harlan Boone, Chief Security Advisor, veteran of 3 administrations, and one of the few people left in the building who understood that power and respect were not the same. He approached, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the woman before him. Then he froze. The scar, the bearing, the silence. It couldn't be. He had read her file once, years ago, after a classified operation that went wrong and was buried under diplomatic secrecy. He had seen her name among the casualties, crossed out, then reinstated. "Elara Vance?" he asked, more to himself than to her. Her gaze shifted to him, calm, unflinching. Recognition passed between them like a spark. The young officer, suddenly uncertain, looked between them. "Sir?" Boone's tone hardened. "Open the doors." "But, sir—" "I said open them." The great doors parted with a groan, revealing a room heavy with ceremony. Inside, the air shimmered with the low hum of political ritual. Long tables were draped with velvet. Rows of brass nameplates glimmered. At the far end, beneath the emblem of the Republic, sat the president, surrounded by advisors, senators, and generals whose uniforms carried entire constellations of medals. Every head turned as she entered. The murmurs began immediately. Confusion, dismissal, a whisper of disdain from one of the senior generals. Another recruit lost her way. Elara walked with the steady gait of someone who had crossed worse fields than this, fields where the ground itself breathed death. Each step echoed softly against the floor. She didn't look at anyone. Her silence didn't come from fear. It came from choice. The president's pen stopped moving. He looked up. His expression changed, subtly at first, then completely. He rose. The room froze. No one had ever seen the president stand like that. Not for generals, not for billionaires, not even for his own vice president. And then, slowly, with visible reverence, he placed his hand over his heart. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. The generals shifted in their seats. The aides stood uncertainly, and the young officer at the door felt his throat close. The president's voice was loud, carrying across the chamber with quiet conviction. "When I was briefed this morning, I was told a recruit would be joining us. They were wrong." He looked at her, and for a moment the weight of all his titles fell away. This woman saved 43 lives in the Sarin Pass. She gave everything, asked for nothing, and vanished without recognition. Today, we correct that. Elara didn't move. The memories of those faces, those she'd saved and those she hadn't, flashed before her eyes. Sand, smoke, the hum of helicopter blades fading into darkness. She remembered Cale's laughter, the smell of burnt metal, the heat of the sun bleeding into her skin. The president continued, turning to the room. "There are soldiers who fight with weapons, and there are soldiers who fight with heart. Lieutenant Vance fought with both. Her silence was never weakness. It was grace under fire." Every person in that room stood then. Chairs scraped softly against the marble, the sound blending into something almost holy. The same officer who had barred her entrance now stood rigid, eyes wide, guilt carving its shape across his face. Elara's expression didn't change, but inside something trembled. A flicker of warmth, like the first light after a long night. The president gestured to an aide, who stepped forward carrying a small velvet box. Within it lay a medal so rarely awarded that most of the people in that chamber had never seen it in person. The Cross of Valor, given only when the act was so selfless that no amount of ceremony could repay it. When he placed it in her hands, he spoke softly, so close that only she could hear. "You remind us what duty truly means." She looked at him for the first time, not at the office he held, but at the man himself. There was gratitude in her gaze, but also sorrow, and a quiet understanding that honor, once earned, was never about recognition. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried across the hall with simple clarity. Respect isn't worn, it's lived. A murmur passed through the crowd, not of chatter, but of reflection. Those words would later appear in articles, printed on posters, quoted in speeches. But in that moment, they were just truth, spoken without performance. Boone, standing near the back, exhaled softly. He had seen the machine of power chew and forget heroes before, but